Sherlock Holmes and the Mystery of the Bank Heist, from the Reminiscences of John H. Watson, M.D., by Arthur Conan Doyle, in style. Chapter 1. The Mystery Begins. It was a brisk morning in early November, the type of day in London where a chill cut through even the thickest coat and the gray sky cast a pallor over the bustling city. The streets were awash with pedestrians, each making their way through the labyrinth of narrow alleyways and wide thoroughfares that converged at the very heart of the metropolis. The clock at St. Paul's had just struck 10 when I, Dr. John Watson, found myself walking down Fleet Street, my thoughts preoccupied with the day's events. It had been some time since I had been called upon by my friend and confidant, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, for anything more than the most trivial of matters. Little did I know that this morning, as I passed the shadowed buildings of the City of London, I was to become embroiled in a case which would occupy much of my attention for days to come. As I reached the corner of Lombard Street, the sound of hurried footsteps caught my ear. Turning, I was struck by the sight of a man in a gray suit, his hat perched at a rakish angle, and his hands clutching at a rolled-up piece of paper. He was running toward me with an air of desperation, his eyes wide and frantic. I stepped aside to avoid his collision, and he nearly collided with the lamppost before stopping to catch his breath. "Dr. Watson," he gasped, his voice betraying panic. "It's urgent. There's been a robbery at the Bank of London." I raised an eyebrow. "A robbery, you say? And how does this concern me?" "I was just at the scene," he continued, still breathless. "The manager, Mr. Harrison, he's been taken hostage, and the police, they have no leads. I don't know where to turn, except to you and your famous companion, Sherlock Holmes." A sharp instinct of curiosity ran through me, and within seconds I was inquiring after the particulars. He spoke quickly, the words tumbling out in a disjointed stream. It seemed that in broad daylight, as the bank was full of business people and clerks, a group of masked men had stormed the building, seized the bank manager, and disappeared as swiftly as they had arrived. Witnesses reported hearing shouts, but no one could provide a coherent description of the criminals, for they had worn nondescript coverings, dark masks, gloves, and coats, leaving no trace of their identities. A seemingly perfect crime. "Very well," I said, slipping my hand into my coat pocket for the keys to my office. "Let us go and inform Holmes. He will want to hear of this, no doubt." When we arrived at 221B Baker Street, I found my friend sitting as usual in his armchair, his long fingers steepled in thought. The sharp scent of tobacco filled the room, the telltale sign of his deep concentration. On the table before him lay a half-read newspaper, which he had clearly discarded in favor of more pressing thoughts. His eyes, however, were drawn to the firelight, as though the flames held the answers to some riddle only he could perceive. "Holmes," I called, stepping into the room. "A bank robbery has occurred. Quite a curious affair, and one that demands your attention." Without turning, Holmes raised his head slightly and murmured, "You need not say more, Watson. The case is already in progress. The game is afoot." The suddenness of his statement caught me off guard. "What do you mean, Holmes? How did you know?" His lips curled into a faint smile, and he finally turned to face me. "The morning was far too still, Watson, and the air smelled of anticipation. Something in the rhythm of the city told me that a disturbance was imminent. You see, the signs were there long before this young man came to us." I glanced at the messenger, who was now standing nervously by the door, clutching his hat in his hands. "You heard the call too, then?" "I did, Watson," Holmes replied, "and I must say, this case already promises to be far more complicated than it first appears." We were then joined by a constable who had arrived in response to Holmes's instructions to be sent over. His breath was heavy from running, and he looked disheveled, as though the day's events had taken their toll. "Sir," the constable said, addressing Holmes directly, "the robbery took place at precisely 9:30 a.m. We have secured the premises, and all the employees have been questioned, but nothing is clear. There is no sign of the thieves or the manager. The entire vault remains untouched, and no one recalls hearing anything out of the ordinary until the criminals struck." Holmes sat forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Tell me, constable, what exactly happened during the robbery? Were there any unusual behaviors from the hostages or the assailants?" The witnesses say it was all very swift. The constable replied. 4 men, masked and heavily armed, burst into the bank through the front doors. The staff and clients froze in terror, and no one was harmed. But the manager, Mr. Harrison, was dragged from behind the counter and ushered into a back room. The criminals had him in their grip, and there was no negotiation, no demand for money or ransom. They simply left as quickly as they came, with Mr. Harrison in tow. A number of employees attempted to follow them, but the thieves vanished into the maze of London streets without a trace. And no one saw their faces? Holmes interjected sharply. No description of their clothing or demeanor. Nothing that could be used, sir, the constable said, shaking his head. They were too quick, too thorough. The masks and gloves they wore concealed everything. Holmes sat still for a moment, tapping his fingers rhythmically on the armrest. This is most curious. The method of the robbery suggests precision, a planned and rehearsed operation. But the lack of a clear motive, the absence of any request for money, and the sudden disappearance of the criminals leave too many questions unanswered. Turning to me, he said, "Watson, we shall have to investigate the bank for any overlooked clues. Perhaps a faint footprint, a forgotten piece of cloth, or an overheard remark. I have a hunch that this is no ordinary robbery. Something else is at play here. Something far more dangerous than meets the eye." At the bank, we were met by the bank's head of security, Mr. Charles Dowling, a stout man in his late 50s, whose stern face conveyed little of his anxiety. He led us through the marble-floored lobby and into the back offices, where the robbery had unfolded. "Mr. Holmes," Mr. Dowling began, wringing his hands in evident distress, "we've scoured the premises. There's no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone left through the back or side doors. It's as though the men vanished into thin air. The staff are rattled, as you can imagine, but I assure you, we've done all we can." Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes scanning every inch of the room as we proceeded through the dark hallways and into Mr. Harrison's private office. "Is this where Mr. Harrison was held?" he asked. "Yes," Dowling replied. "For the briefest of moments, we think. They had him sit in that chair, but no one recalls what happened after that. The assailants seemed very careful not to leave any trace behind." Holmes knelt down beside the chair, inspecting the floor with a keen eye. "Interesting," he muttered. "The chair is in its usual position, but there," he pointed to a faint smudge of what appeared to be dirt just beside the leg of the desk. "This mark is not typical. It's fresh, and the dirt is of a peculiar sort, a strange find indeed." A moment of silence fell over the room as Holmes leaned in closer. "The answer lies here, Watson," he said, his voice quiet but intense, "and we must find it before it slips from our grasp." Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. The day had already worn on, and the once brisk morning had melted into a murky afternoon. Fog, the notorious harbinger of London's autumnal gloom, had rolled in from the river, swallowing up the streets and cloaking the buildings in an eerie mist. I stood in the quiet of the office, feeling the weight of Holmes's words upon me, the tension between us palpable as we continued our investigation. Holmes had not yet revealed the full extent of his thoughts, but there was a certain gravity to his demeanor that suggested he was working through a puzzle far more intricate than we could yet see. After a cursory inspection of Mr. Harrison's office, Holmes had requested to see the bank manager's personal files. Dowling, the head of security, had complied without protest, though his discomfort was evident. It was clear that something more than a simple robbery was at play here. Holmes was mulling over the evidence as he sifted through the documents with his usual efficiency. "I wonder," Holmes murmured, his voice trailing off as his keen eyes scanned the papers before him. "Could there be more to Mr. Harrison than meets the eye? A man in his position, involved in something as clean-cut as banking, may not appear to have a past of significance, but there is always more than what is visible on the surface." I raised an eyebrow. "You think the robbery is more than just a random act, then?" "Indeed, Watson," Holmes replied, looking up from the papers, his eyes flashing with the sharpness I had come to expect. "A robbery of this nature, so meticulously planned, so precise, suggests a deeper connection, a connection that might involve forces far greater than ordinary criminals. It is not beyond my reasoning that a figure such as Professor Moriarty might have a hand in this affair." The name struck me like a thunderbolt. Professor Moriarty, Holmes's arch-nemesis, the criminal mastermind whose shadow loomed large over all of London's criminal underworld. To suggest his involvement in a robbery of this nature seemed far-fetched, but given Holmes's formidable mind, I knew it was a possibility that could not be dismissed so easily. "But how, Holmes?" I asked. "Moriarty is known to deal in grand schemes, international plots, intricate webs of deceit. A simple daylight robbery doesn't fit his modus operandi." Holmes's fingers tapped the edge of the desk. "You are correct in one regard, Watson. A simple heist is beneath Moriarty. But this event, this kidnapping of Mr. Harrison, feels different. The mask-wearing assailants, the swift and deliberate departure, it is as though they were following a script, one that they knew by heart." He paused for a moment, his face inscrutable. "If Moriarty is behind this, we must tread carefully. His web is not easily untangled. For now, though, we are left to speculate. Let us see what more Mr. Harrison's past can reveal." We were not kept waiting long. Mr. Dowling returned shortly with the requested files in hand. His face was ashen, and his brow furrowed in distress, as though something in the documents had shaken him. Without a word, he handed the stack to Holmes, who immediately began flipping through the pages with a practiced eye. I watched as Holmes's face transformed from casual curiosity to something more serious. "Mr. Harrison," Holmes began, after a few moments of quiet reading, "seems to have lived a life that is anything but exemplary. A reputable banker, yes, but before his rise in the financial world, he was involved in a series of questionable ventures, several failed businesses, a few unsubstantiated debts, and an unfortunate brush with the law for matters that were, shall we say, not entirely transparent." I took a step closer, peering over Holmes's shoulder. "What sort of unfortunate brush are you referring to?" Holmes tapped a particular passage in the file with a slender finger. "It seems Mr. Harrison was, at one point, connected to a company involved in importing foreign goods, unregulated imports, to be precise. The company, it appears, went bankrupt under mysterious circumstances, and Mr. Harrison's name was associated with a large sum of missing funds. The case was quietly closed, but the reputation remained tarnished." "How intriguing," I said, my brow furrowing. "Could this be connected to his kidnapping?" Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his gaze far away. "I suspect so, Watson. If Harrison's past dealings were not entirely above board, he may have made enemies along the way. Enemies who would have had the means and motivation to abduct him. Perhaps they seek retribution for past wrongs." "But why the masks, Holmes?" I asked. "Why the elaborate ruse, if the intention was simply to extract revenge or some form of extortion?" Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "That, my dear Watson, is what does not sit well with me. The masks suggest something far more deliberate than a personal vendetta. They suggest an organized and cold-blooded operation. And that, in turn, leads me to believe that there may be someone behind the scenes orchestrating this. Someone with both the means and the motive to carry out such a task. A figure like Moriarty." My heart skipped a beat at the mention of the name. "But how can we be sure, Holmes? There is no direct evidence linking Moriarty to the robbery or to Harrison's past dealings." "True," Holmes replied, his voice firm with conviction. "But evidence, as you know, is often a slippery thing. It is the connections between pieces of information that often lead us to the truth. And there are too many oddities here to ignore. The precision of the crime, the use of masks, the swift disappearance, Harrison's shady past. It is all too neatly tied together, Watson. And I have the distinct feeling that we are being guided down a path, one that leads straight into the heart of Moriarty's criminal empire." Later that evening, we visited the scene of the crime once again. Holmes had insisted that we conduct a thorough investigation of the bank itself, as he was convinced that some clue had been overlooked. The evening had fallen into darkness, and the fog had thickened, casting an almost suffocating weight on the air. The streets of London were quiet now, save for the occasional carriage rumbling past, the sound of hooves clicking against the cobblestone. We arrived at the bank, and the doors creaked open slowly as Mr. Dowling led us through the silent halls. The staff had long since departed, leaving only the faint echo of their hurried footsteps. We retraced our steps through the lobby, down the corridor, and to the back office where Harrison had been taken. Holmes was now examining the floor once again, looking for any discrepancies in the markings and scuff marks left behind by the criminals. "Here?" Holmes said suddenly, pointing to a small indentation near the edge of the room. "Do you see that, Watson?" I bent down to inspect the mark. It was barely noticeable, a slight dent in the floorboard, as though something heavy had been dragged across the wood. Holmes ran his fingers over it, as though measuring its depth. "It's faint," I observed, "but certainly unusual. What do you think it means?" Holmes stood up and looked around the room, his eyes scanning the walls and the furniture with sharp intensity. "It means that they were not as careful as they thought. These marks suggest that Mr. Harrison was not moved voluntarily. He was forced out of this office, dragged in a hurried fashion. But the most curious aspect of this is the position of the mark itself. It leads directly toward the rear exit. Someone wanted to ensure that Mr. Harrison left the premises in a very particular way." I looked at Holmes, a sense of realization dawning upon me. "The back exit. You think they were trying to avoid being seen, but at the same time, they wanted to leave a trace behind?" "Precisely, Watson," Holmes said with a glint in his eyes. "It was all part of the plan. The criminals wanted to ensure that we could trace their movements, but not in a way that would lead us to their true purpose." The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but the final connection remained elusive. Professor Moriarty's shadow loomed large, and yet there was no direct proof linking him to the crime. What was it that had led these masked men to take Mr. Harrison? And what was it that they wanted from him? The answers seemed just out of reach, hidden beneath layers of intrigue and mystery. But Holmes was as determined as ever, and I knew that with each passing moment, the truth was inching ever closer to being revealed. As we left the bank that night, Holmes looked up at the darkened sky, his eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. "This is only the beginning, Watson," he said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "The game is far from over, and I have no doubt that our paths will soon cross with those who are behind this plot. The truth will come to light, whether they want it to or not." Chapter 3: The Message in the Paper. The next day began much like any other at 221B Baker Street, with the steady hum of London's life outside, punctuated by the occasional horse-drawn carriage rumbling past. My morning was spent reviewing my notes from the previous evening's investigation, but I could not escape the feeling of unease that had been settling in my chest. Holmes, ever the enigma, had not shared much with me since our visit to the bank. His mind was clearly working on something, a puzzle to which I was not yet privy. But what concerned me most was his silence regarding the elusive connection to Professor Moriarty. A shadow I feared would loom over us until we uncovered the truth. Holmes had retreated into his study, as was his habit when absorbed by a case, but I could hear the faint sound of his violin drifting from the room, its mournful notes echoing through the quiet of our flat. I had come to associate this melody with his more contemplative moments, and it was clear that he was deep in thought. It was just after noon when the letter arrived. The knock on the door was quiet, almost tentative. Mrs. Hudson, our ever-faithful landlady, opened it and found a plain brown envelope addressed simply to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street. She handed it to me with an odd look, but said nothing more, as though something about it had unsettled her. When I opened the envelope, the first thing I noticed was the weight of the paper. It was thick, almost luxurious, and had a peculiar texture, unlike anything I had encountered in the usual correspondence. It was smooth to the touch, but oddly coarse in places, as if the paper had been pressed in a way that left an imprint on its surface. My curiosity was immediately piqued, but the message itself gave me pause. In neat, almost deliberate handwriting, it read, "Sherlock Holmes, the game is afoot. We know you're watching, and we know you're close. But beware. You will not find your answers where you expect. This is no ordinary robbery. It is a game, and we are the players. You may search, you may deduce, but the truth is not where you think. Be careful of the paper you hold. Its origin will lead you to the next clue, until we meet again." The words were chilling in their simplicity, and yet I could not shake the feeling that this note was more than just a taunt. Holmes, who had appeared to be lost in his own world, suddenly stepped from his study, his brow furrowed as he noticed the letter in my hand. "Another message, Watson?" he asked, his tone calm, though there was an unmistakable edge to it. "Yes," I replied, handing him the note. "It seems to be a challenge, Holmes, though I'm not sure from whom." Holmes took the letter, his sharp eyes scanning the words with the same precision that he applied to every case. After a moment, he folded it carefully and turned it over in his hands. "Interesting," he murmured. "Not simply a taunt, but a warning. Whoever sent this is trying to distract us, to throw us off course. And yet, they have made a mistake." I blinked, unable to follow his thoughts. "A mistake?" "Yes, Watson," he replied, a faint smile crossing his lips. "The paper itself. There is something unique about it, a clue hidden in plain sight, one that I suspect will lead us closer to the answer." I looked at him, bewildered. "What do you mean? It's just paper, perhaps a bit unusual, but nothing that would give us a lead." Holmes shook his head, his eyes gleaming with the excitement of a new challenge. "Ah, Watson, you underestimate the importance of even the smallest details. This paper is no ordinary stationery. Its texture, its composition, it carries with it an imprint, one that could be traced. We need to examine it more closely." Holmes's keen observations led us to the work table in our sitting room, where he began inspecting the letter with a magnifying glass, running his fingers lightly over the surface of the paper. It was difficult to discern at first, but as his fingers brushed over the fibers, it became clear. The paper was not only unusual in its texture, but it also bore a faint pattern, an imprint that seemed deliberate, as though something had been pressed into it. "Notice the edges here, Watson," Holmes said, pointing to the faint lines etched into the paper. "These are not merely the result of manufacturing. Someone has deliberately marked this paper in a particular way. It suggests that the paper was handled in a specific manner, perhaps even by an individual or a machine that we can identify." I leaned in, squinting at the markings. They were faint, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, but when illuminated by the light from the window, I could make out the outlines of small, intricate symbols, a series of letters and numbers, almost hidden within the texture of the paper. Holmes's eyes gleamed with recognition. "A code," he said, almost to himself. "A clue hidden in plain sight." "But what does it mean?" I asked, feeling a thrill of excitement. "Is it a cipher, or simply a signature?" Holmes shook his head, his mind already working through the possibilities. "It is not a cipher, Watson. It is something much more specific. These are the sorts of markings you might find on paper produced in a printing press, perhaps from a specialized printer or printing house. We can deduce that this paper was not printed at a standard stationer's shop. No, it is far more specialized than that." I could see where Holmes was going. "You think we could trace it to a particular printer?" "Precisely," Holmes said, his voice full of quiet excitement. "We can't simply rely on the obvious leads. This paper will take us further, if we can locate where it was produced. I believe the printer's mark will give us a starting point, Watson. From there, we can find a list of establishments that deal in such unique paper." "But where do we begin?" I asked, feeling the weight of the task ahead. Holmes's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "We begin, Watson, with the one man who may know more about such establishments than anyone else in this city." Later that afternoon, we made our way to Scotland Yard, where we were greeted by the ever-steadfast Inspector Lestrade. The inspector's sharp eyes and his penchant for detail had often served us well in the past, though his sometimes frustrating tendency to dismiss Holmes's unconventional methods had caused no small amount of tension between them. Still, there was no one better when it came to navigating the bureaucratic labyrinth of police records, and Holmes had no intention of facing this particular obstacle alone. "Holmes," Lestrade greeted us, his expression a mixture of curiosity and mild annoyance. "I suppose this means you're back at it again? What is it this time?" Holmes wasted no time in explaining our current predicament, presenting the strange paper to Lestrade. The inspector eyed it skeptically, but the sight of Holmes's unyielding confidence was enough to pique his interest. "So you think this paper can lead us to a printing house?" Lestrade asked, his brows furrowed. "Isn't that a bit far-fetched, even for you, Holmes?" "Far-fetched?" Holmes said, his voice laced with quiet amusement. "Not in the slightest. The markings on this paper are not random, Lestrade. they were intentionally placed there by someone who knows the value of a detail. I need a list of all printing establishments that may deal in such paper. One of them may be the key to unraveling this mystery. Lestrade nodded slowly, the wheels of his mind turning. I'll see what I can do. It won't be easy, mind you, but I can make some inquiries. Holmes smiled. I knew I could rely on you, Inspector. I look forward to hearing what you uncover. The following hours were spent in anticipation as we awaited Lestrade's report. Holmes, ever patient, had resumed his violin playing, the familiar tune echoing through the apartment as he continued to piece together the fragments of the case. I sat quietly, my thoughts running in many directions at once. The game was truly afoot now, but the true mastermind remained hidden in the shadows, waiting for us to make the next move. When Lestrade finally returned late that evening, his expression was one of both frustration and intrigue. I've got something. Holmes, he said, handing over a list of addresses for several printing presses in the city. But I'll warn you, these places don't look like the sort of operations that would deal with high-end paper. Some of them are rather shady, even by our standards. Holmes took the list with a nod, his eyes scanning the names quickly. This will do, he said. We shall begin our investigation immediately. Thank you, Lestrade. Your assistance is invaluable, as always. As the inspector left, Holmes looked up at me, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. The next step, Watson, will be the most critical. Let us see where these establishments lead us, and how they tie into the mystery at hand. And so, with the first thread of our investigation now uncovered, we prepared to follow the trail wherever it might take us. Chapter 4. The Government's Paper. The chill of the evening air swept through the narrow streets of London as Holmes and I made our way to the first address on the list provided by Inspector Lestrade. The place was tucked between a row of drab buildings near Fleet Street, an inconspicuous corner of the city that seemed to shelter secrets in the shadow of its brick walls. We had learned that the paper used in the mysterious note was produced by a particular printing press, a place with a very specific reputation, Thorne and Ashford Paper Mills. The name alone did little to raise suspicion, but the more we had learned, the clearer it became that this mill was no ordinary operation. As we arrived at the address, Holmes's sharp gaze scanned the surroundings, noting the high walls and the iron gates surrounding the building. It looked like any industrial complex, and yet there was an air of exclusivity about it, a sense that it was more than it seemed. Holmes had been suspicious of the connection between this paper mill and the note since the first time he had touched the strange sheet of paper. We approached the front door, which was guarded by a single doorman in a dark suit. He raised an eyebrow at us as we drew near. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice as polished as his attire. Holmes stepped forward with his characteristic calm. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We're investigating a matter that we believe may be connected to your establishment. I would like to speak with the person in charge, if you please." The doorman's demeanor shifted slightly, and I could see the shift in his expression, though he was careful not to show it. After a long pause, he stepped back and motioned for us to follow him. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. If you would follow me, please." We entered the building and were led down a hallway lined with windows that revealed the massive machinery of the paper mill, churning in rhythm with the industrial heartbeat of the city. The smell of freshly processed paper lingered in the air, and I noted the cleanliness of the facility, which seemed to radiate a sense of importance. We came to a small office at the end of the hall, where a man in his 50s, dressed in a suit that was just a shade too formal for the setting, greeted us with a stiff, formal nod. "Mr. Ashford, I presume?" Holmes inquired, his voice sharp with the force of a man accustomed to getting straight to the point. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, I am," the man replied. "What is it that brings you to Thorne and Ashford? I am afraid we do not usually entertain visitors without prior notice." Holmes wasted no time with pleasantries. "I believe your mill may be the source of the paper used in a note we recently received. I'd like to know more about the paper you manufacture, particularly any connections you might have with high-security or government-grade products." Mr. Ashford's face remained neutral, but I could sense a flicker of tension in his eyes. He paused before answering, as though weighing the consequences of revealing too much. Our mill produces a variety of paper, Mr. Holmes, including some that is indeed of the highest quality. We have contracts with several high-profile clients, including various governmental bodies. However, I am not aware of any involvement with private individuals, nor would I be at liberty to discuss specifics regarding any government contracts, he said smoothly, his tone betraying the faintest edge of caution. Holmes raised an eyebrow, his sharp gaze piercing through the man's carefully crafted demeanor. So you are saying that your mill produces paper specifically for government use? How curious. Can you tell me, Mr. Ashford, if you have ever produced paper with a unique texture, one that could be used for highly confidential documents? Ashford hesitated, his fingers tapping against the wooden surface of the desk. We do indeed produce a special grade of paper for certain government entities, but I cannot speak to the specifics of the projects that it is used for, Mr. Holmes. It is a matter of national security. Holmes, ever the persistent investigator, pressed on. But why this particular paper mill, Mr. Ashford? Why does the government choose Thorne and Ashford for such sensitive work? There must be something unique about your process, something that sets you apart from other mills. For the first time since our arrival, Mr. Ashford's expression shifted, and he lowered his voice slightly. That, Mr. Holmes, is a question I am not authorized to answer. The air between us thickened as Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. But, Mr. Ashford, if you were to answer that question, it could clear up some rather troubling inconsistencies in a case we are investigating. You see, the paper used in a recent note appears to have come from your mill, and the pattern on it suggests that it could be part of a batch used for government work, a batch that could be linked to a rather large criminal operation. The man's lips pressed tightly together. For a moment, he seemed to be weighing his options, and then, as though something within him broke, he spoke quietly. You are correct, Mr. Holmes, he admitted reluctantly. There is something unique about our process, something that we are, how shall I put it, known for. Our mill specializes in producing a paper that is used for top-secret government documents. We have a few clients in high places. But it's not the paper itself that's so important, it's the process by which we manufacture it. You see, we've been involved in certain government projects for decades, and our paper is crafted in a way that makes it nearly impossible to duplicate. It's a combination of materials and techniques that only a handful of mills in the world possess. That's why we're trusted. And yet, Holmes pressed, the note you mentioned, where was it printed? Could it be tied to your government clients? Ashford paused. His eyes darted to a drawer in his desk, where I suspected he kept records or correspondence that he might not want to share. I cannot speak to any specific note, Mr. Holmes, but I can tell you that we are bound by confidentiality agreements. What I can tell you is that this process, the one that makes our paper so sought after, was developed decades ago, and it is used exclusively for government contracts. But, he trailed off as if the thought had suddenly occurred to him. But, Holmes repeated, his interest piqued. Ashford leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The only reason anyone would use that particular paper outside of government circles would be if they had a very specific, perhaps dangerous interest in it. Holmes's eyes flashed with understanding. A dangerous interest? In what way? Ashford swallowed hard. I don't know the full details. But I do know that one of the most recent orders we fulfilled was for a document that was to be delivered directly to the highest levels of government. That order, it's the reason we've been under more scrutiny than usual, and now I believe that someone is using our paper for something else entirely. Holmes stood up slowly, his mind clearly racing through 100 possibilities. It seems we may have stumbled upon something far larger than we initially thought. This mill, this paper, is at the center of a far-reaching scheme. A scheme that could involve not only criminal organizations, but possibly even elements within the government. The gravity of Ashford's words hung in the air like a thick fog. Holmes turned to me with that familiar glint in his eyes. Watson, we have a new question to answer. Why this paper mill? What is it that makes this particular facility so vital to the criminals behind this case? And more importantly, who is pulling the strings from the shadows. As we left Thorne and Ashford, the questions only deepened. We were now certain that the robbery, the note, and the elusive figure behind it all were part of a much larger conspiracy. A conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the government itself. We had to act quickly. The game, as the note had so boldly stated, was afoot. Chapter 5. A shadow at the heart of government. The situation had grown both more complex and more unsettling by the hour. Holmes and I had spent the better part of the morning in the company of Mycroft, my brother, whose prodigious intellect was well known, though his particular brand of analysis often left me exhausted in ways I could not entirely explain. Mycroft was a man of habit and a man of government. He served as a civil servant at the highest level, his influence quietly stretching into the farthest corners of the British Empire, his hand guiding the affairs of the state with a precision most could only dream of. When Holmes had requested a consultation with Mycroft, I had expected the usual cryptic remarks and an unhealthy amount of tea drinking, but what transpired was much more. We had laid the facts before him, detailing everything from the peculiar nature of the note to the mysterious paper trail that led us to Thorne and Ashford paper mills. Mycroft listened with the practiced attentiveness of a man who had spent his life considering the details others might overlook. His brow furrowed as he took in the information, and he dismissed the notion that the government's Home Office was the true target of the criminals. It seemed far too insignificant for such a carefully orchestrated operation. His conclusion was swift. While the Home Office is important, Mycroft said, tapping his fingers on the polished surface of his desk, there is little in that office at present that would warrant such an elaborate plan. Documents of significance have been moved, you see. A recent reorganization has made that department less attractive to those with more nefarious inclinations. Holmes, ever the skeptic, leaned forward. But there is the connection to the paper, the same paper that's been used for something secret. Something only your office, Mycroft, would know about. Mycroft sighed, his face sagging with the weight of his knowledge. It is indeed true that certain government-grade documents are printed using the paper from Thorne and Ashford, but not for anything in the Home Office at the moment. As far as I am aware, all the major operations currently in motion are focused elsewhere. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Then why, Mycroft? Are they making a play for it? A robbery gone awry, a kidnapped bank manager. These aren't random events. There must be a reason they took a shot at the Home Office, even if you claim there is nothing of value there. Mycroft leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. I believe you are overlooking a far more insidious play, Sherlock. The goal is not the Home Office at all. It's the Home Secretary himself, or more precisely, putting pressure on him. I blinked, taken aback. Pressure? But why would anyone want to pressure the Home Secretary? Because, Watson, Mycroft said, his voice cold and calculating, the Home Secretary is an obstacle. He is a man who stands between certain powerful individuals and their goals. To him, power and authority are matters of law and tradition, and that makes him a symbol of resistance to those who wish to manipulate the state for their own ends. Holmes paced the room, his mind clearly whirring. You're saying they were attempting to manipulate the Home Secretary directly, to force him into some position of weakness or submission? Yes, Mycroft replied, nodding, but they have miscalculated. The Home Secretary is not a man easily moved by threats. In fact, he is known for his unyielding temperament. And so, Sherlock, I suspect they are now turning to more extreme measures. Holmes's gaze sharpened. You mean kidnapping? Mycroft's lips tightened into a thin line. Exactly. I suspect the criminals have already made their next move. Their target, however, may not be the Home Secretary himself, but someone far more vulnerable. The realization hit like a hammer. Holmes's eyes glinted with a cold light, his mind already at work, running through scenarios faster than I could follow. His wife, Holmes muttered under his breath, more to himself than to us. A wife is far more likely to be taken than a man of political weight, and the kidnappers would know that. They want leverage. If they can't manipulate him through political pressure, they will use his family, and he will bend for her sake. Mycroft's face remained grim. The Home Secretary's wife, Elizabeth, is a known figure in society, an important figure. She is adored by many, and her disappearance would put unimaginable pressure on her husband. I have no doubt they have already begun making their move." Holmes's expression turned steely. "We must act quickly then. If we do not stop this before they succeed, we risk plunging the government into chaos." Mycroft's voice was quiet but firm. "The Home Secretary will not reveal his vulnerability to the public. But you are correct, Sherlock. Time is of the essence." Without further hesitation, we departed Mycroft's office. Holmes had already formulated a plan, and I could see his mind moving faster than my own as we made our way through the fog-drenched streets of London. Our next stop was the Home Secretary's residence. We had no time to waste. By the time we reached the grand residence of the Home Secretary, night had fallen, casting shadows over the building. The heavy iron gates creaked as we passed through, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as we made our way up the long, winding path toward the front door. We were greeted by a flustered butler who ushered us inside quickly, his face pale with worry. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I'm so glad you've come. There's been an incident, something dreadful." We followed him up a grand staircase, the carpets plush beneath our feet, until we reached the sitting room. There, standing at the hearth, was the Home Secretary himself, his hands clenched tightly behind his back. His face was pale, his normally impeccable attire disheveled, as though he had not slept for days. "Holmes," he said, his voice tight with emotion, "I am afraid you are too late. My wife, Elizabeth, has been taken." Holmes stepped forward, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Tell me everything, sir. Where were you when this happened?" The Home Secretary looked at us with a mixture of frustration and despair. "It happened just a few hours ago. Elizabeth was walking in the garden when a group of men, masked and armed, approached her. They took her without a word and vanished before anyone could respond." "Who are these men?" I asked, my voice low. The Home Secretary shook his head, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I don't know. I have no idea who they are or what they want, but I'm certain this has to do with my position. They want to break me, Holmes. They want to weaken me and force me to make choices that I cannot afford." Holmes's face darkened as he turned to face the room, his mind working furiously to piece together the puzzle. "This is precisely as we feared. They have chosen the one thing you cannot afford to lose, your wife. They will use her as leverage to force your hand." "Then what should I do, Holmes?" the Home Secretary asked, his voice desperate. Holmes stood still for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back as his gaze drifted to the window. "We shall use your wife as bait, but not in the way they expect. We will find them before they make their next move, and we will ensure that they will never threaten you or her again." As we set to work, I felt a growing sense of urgency. The game was no longer confined to criminals hiding in the shadows. It had now entered the very halls of government itself. What had begun as a simple robbery had escalated into something far more dangerous, a conspiracy that threatened to unravel the stability of the state, and it seemed that, for once, the criminals had played their hand too early. The game was indeed afoot, and we would play it to the bitter end. Chapter 6. The Silent House in Soho. The night was thick with fog as Holmes and I stood before the grand estate in Soho, a mansion once bustling with the finest society that London had to offer. Now, under the pall of darkness and silence, it appeared forlorn, like a ghost of its former self. The Home Secretary's wife, Elizabeth, was supposed to be inside, held captive, yet all around us, there was nothing to suggest life, or even the presence of her captors. Holmes scrutinized the building with the sharpness of a hawk. His eyes darted over every window, every shadow, analyzing every minute detail as if it could give away a secret. His brain, always calculating, was hard at work, devising a plan. "We're certain this is the location?" I asked, my voice quiet against the backdrop of the night's silence. Holmes nodded curtly, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Watson, the trail leads us here. The Home Secretary's wife has been kept in this very house, but I believe our quarry knows we're close. I suspect they've already moved her." I felt a cold shiver at the possibility, but Holmes had never been one to offer conjecture without foundation. His certainty was something I had come to rely upon, often with both awe and trepidation. "We should proceed cautiously," I suggested. though I could tell that Holmes had already formulated a plan of action in his mind. The house may be a trap. Holmes merely nodded, and with a subtle movement, he signaled for me to follow as he moved toward the rear of the mansion. We slipped through the garden, our steps muffled by the thick overgrowth of ivy and underbrush that surrounded the property. It had once been a place of grandeur, but now it seemed as if time had claimed it, leaving only traces of its former beauty. Holmes examined the back entrance, his keen eyes noticing the faintest marks on the doorframe. "They've been here recently," he muttered, "but the question is, are they still here?" We tried the door handle, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a darkened hallway within. Holmes stepped forward without hesitation, his silhouette briefly illuminated by the light of a gas lamp outside before it was swallowed by the darkness of the house. I followed closely, my hand on the grip of my revolver, though I knew that violence was not Holmes's preferred solution. Inside, the air was stale, untouched, as though no one had lived in the house for months, perhaps even years. It was an unsettling contrast to the grandeur of the exterior, with its cold stone floors and empty, echoing rooms. The silence was deafening, each step we took seeming to stir the shadows that clung to the walls like memories of things long gone. Holmes moved silently from room to room, his steps as light as a cat's. He had a knack for slipping through the shadows unnoticed, a talent that had served us well on more than one occasion. As we crept through the hallway, we came upon the large sitting room at the end of the corridor. The curtains were drawn, but light from the street lamps outside filtered through the cracks, illuminating the dusty furniture and old portraits that adorned the walls. The room was eerily quiet. "Nothing," Holmes said, his voice a mere whisper. "They're gone." I felt a sense of unease settle over me, but Holmes's gaze did not linger on the room's emptiness. He moved toward a large marble fireplace at the far side of the room, his sharp eyes scanning the floor and the hearth. He knelt down, peering into the ashes with the practiced attention of a man who had seen far too many scenes of destruction and deceit. "Ah!" he said softly. "What have we here?" I stepped forward, glancing down into the hearth. There, amidst the half-burned remains of what seemed like a pile of papers, were the remnants of something more substantial. Papers that had been deliberately set alight, but the flames had not entirely consumed them. Some fragments were barely singed, their edges curling and blackened, but the ink was still legible. Holmes picked up one of the largest fragments with delicate care, his gloved fingers tracing the charred edges. "German," he murmured, his lips barely moving. "The language of the document is German." I leaned in closer, my curiosity piqued. Sure enough, the twisted remains of the page revealed a clear script, though the rest of the letter was too burned to read. Holmes read aloud the few decipherable words. "Vorbereitung, über die Grenze müssen handeln." He paused, translating. "Preparation, across the border, must act." I glanced at him, sensing his growing realization. "This is it, isn't it? The clue we've been searching for." Holmes nodded, his brow furrowed. "It seems that the kidnappers are working with someone else, possibly across international lines. The mention of the border could indicate movement across the channel, perhaps into Europe. These men are not just simple criminals, Watson. They are part of something much larger." We both fell silent for a moment, the weight of the discovery settling over us. Who were these men? And what were they after? And what did they want with Elizabeth, the Home Secretary's wife? Holmes was already piecing things together. This document may hold the key, but it is far from complete. If these men are working with international forces, then they are part of a far-reaching plot, one that involves more than just blackmailing a political figure. As Holmes stood, his gaze drifted toward the door, where faint sounds of movement reached our ears. Someone was coming. It could be the kidnappers, or perhaps the police, though I doubted they would have arrived so quickly. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "We must leave, Watson, but before we do, we need to take these fragments with us. The remainder of this document may reveal more, but for now, our best course is to get to Mycroft. He may know more about this international angle than we do." We made our way back through the dark halls, but the sense of foreboding lingered. Whoever was behind this operation was playing a game much larger than we had first imagined. The stakes were no longer confined to London. Now it seemed that this plot reached across borders, involving dark forces that had yet to reveal their true purpose. As we stepped out of the mansion, the fog pressed in around us, thickening like a veil. The street lamps cast ghostly shadows on the pavement, and in that eerie silence, I felt as if we were being watched, closely. "We're not the only ones hunting for answers," Holmes said quietly, his eyes scanning the darkness. "But we must beat them to the truth. Time is slipping away." With the fragments of the letter in hand, we turned back toward our next destination. Mycroft. What he would make of this new revelation was anyone's guess, but I had little doubt that the game was far from over. If anything, it was only just beginning. Chapter 7. A Web Spun Too Wide. The days following our discovery at the abandoned estate in Soho were filled with a quiet urgency that seemed to hang in the air like the oppressive fog over London. What had begun as a routine investigation into a daylight bank robbery, one of the many commonplace crimes in the bustling heart of the city, had now blossomed into a tangled mess of international intrigue, political tension, and quite possibly the seeds of a far-reaching conspiracy that threatened to ripple across the European continent and beyond. As Holmes and I walked toward the grand residence of Mycroft Holmes, I could not shake the unease that had taken hold of me. The fragments of the burned letter, with its cryptic references to preparation and crossing the border, had set the stage for a far greater revelation than we could have anticipated. The kidnappers' motives were no longer clear, and their connections had far outgrown the scope of what we had initially believed. With Mycroft's latest information in hand, I couldn't help but feel the magnitude of the situation, its depth, its complexity, and the danger it posed. By the time we reached Mycroft's office, nestled within the labyrinthine corridors of Whitehall, the weight of the world seemed to press down on my shoulders. Holmes, though ever composed, shared my sense of foreboding. He entered his brother's office with that peculiar air of quiet assurance that only he could manage, a posture that suggested he knew far more than he was letting on. His mind, razor sharp and 10 steps ahead of anyone else, had already begun analyzing every facet of this new development. The moment we stepped into the room, Mycroft rose from behind his desk with a deliberate slowness. His appearance, as ever, was immaculate, his suit precise, his expression thoughtful, yet there was an underlying tension in the air that even he could not entirely conceal. "I've been expecting you," Mycroft said, his deep voice echoing off the cold walls of his office. "I trust your investigation has unearthed some interesting findings?" Holmes placed the half-burned papers onto Mycroft's desk, his eyes never leaving his brother's face. "Interesting indeed, but we still lack the full picture, Mycroft. These fragments," he continued, tapping the edge of the paper with his finger, "mention something of preparations across the border. Do you know anything about this?" Mycroft leaned forward, studying the papers carefully before sighing. He sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled before his face. "I can tell you that this letter's contents are troubling, to say the least," he said slowly. "But what's more troubling is the fact that none of our official military or government channels have picked up on any such movement. This is strange, Sherlock." Holmes frowned. "It's hard to believe, isn't it? This plan is no small matter. You've confirmed as much?" "Quite." Mycroft's voice softened, his brow furrowing as he spoke. "I have checked every available report, and there is no indication of any such activity. No intercepts, no intelligence reports. Nothing." A brief silence filled the room as Holmes processed this information, his mind working furiously behind those cold, calculating eyes. "That cannot be," Holmes said finally, his voice tinged with disbelief. "If this plot involves preparations at such a high level, there is no way that it has gone unnoticed by your people. Surely someone in the military or diplomatic channels should have picked up something by now." "I agree," Mycroft replied, his gaze narrowing. "But what troubles me more is that this seems to be a well-coordinated effort. Whoever is behind this, they are careful, calculating. And powerful," Holmes added grimly. "No ordinary criminals, this. They must have inside knowledge, either of your department or, worse, of the governments involved." Mycroft sighed deeply and leaned back in his chair. I'd like to believe that it's just an oversight or a miscommunication, but the truth is far more worrying. The absence of any intelligence on this matter is too precise to be ignored. It's as if they're actively concealing their movements. And whoever they are, they have resources at their disposal that even our most skilled operatives cannot trace. But why the Home Secretary's wife? I asked, unable to contain my curiosity any longer. Is there a connection we're missing? What is her role in all of this? That, Mycroft said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully, is where it becomes more sinister. The Home Secretary's wife, Elizabeth, is a woman of modest social standing, though her husband wields considerable influence in government. There is nothing about her past or her background that would make her an obvious target, but that's precisely what makes this case all the more baffling. I nodded. So, you're suggesting that her kidnapping is part of something larger? But what? What could they want with her? Mycroft stood, pacing slowly across the room. The fact that she was taken means that someone wants to use her as leverage. That's clear enough. But for what? A political scandal? A demand for some kind of ransom? He paused, his gaze turning toward Holmes. Or perhaps a more subtle game, one with consequences beyond the immediate moment. Holmes was quiet for a long time, lost in thought. What if we are dealing with a strategic move to destabilize a fragile political climate? He said at last. A plot so carefully designed that it can bring the nations of Europe to the brink of war. Mycroft raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by the leap in logic. That is a possibility, Sherlock. But what makes it so alarming is that, as of now, there is no trace of this plot in any diplomatic circles. Not a whisper of it in official records. It's as if they are working entirely outside the system, targeting individuals instead of institutions. This is beginning to sound like the kind of maneuver that would precede a world war, I murmured, realizing the implications of what Holmes had just suggested. Mycroft's expression darkened. That's exactly what I'm afraid of, Watson. What we are seeing may very well be a series of covert operations, carefully planned and executed by those who know exactly how to avoid detection. Holmes turned back to the fragments of the letter. But why these preparations? What are they gearing up for? That, Sherlock, Mycroft said, a faint edge of frustration in his voice, is the key question, and I do not have an answer. Yet. I watched as Holmes's eyes narrowed, his mind already working, trying to connect the dots. It doesn't make sense. A plan of such magnitude, and yet nothing in the official channels? He stood abruptly, his movements sharp. We need to find out who's behind this and why they've gone to such lengths to remain hidden. But we must be careful. Yet, Mycroft warned. Whoever is pulling the strings here is far more dangerous than we've anticipated. If we push too hard, we may uncover something far darker than a mere political maneuver. Holmes turned to face his brother, his gaze unwavering. There is no turning back now, Mycroft. Not when it's this close to the precipice. We will find the answers, and we will stop it before it's too late. Mycroft studied him for a moment longer, then gave a reluctant nod. Very well, Sherlock. But be cautious. The forces at play here are not as they seem. With that, we left Mycroft's office and returned to our investigation, the weight of the situation settling in like a fog. What had started as a simple robbery now held the potential to tear apart the very fabric of international relations, threatening to drag England and all of Europe into the fires of war. Whoever was behind this plot had hidden their tracks well, but I had no doubt that we would find them. The question, however, was whether we could stop them in time. Chapter 8. The Final Stretch. The rain had begun to fall heavily, the droplets streaking down the windows of our carriage as Holmes and I sat in silence, each lost in our thoughts. We had spent the better part of the day chasing down leads, and although we were closer to the truth, the shadow of uncertainty still hung over us. The spy, or rather, the network of spies, remained elusive, but we were closing in. Holmes, I began, breaking the silence. Where exactly are we headed? We know the spy is headed toward the train station, but what's to say they won't slip through our fingers once again? Holmes glanced at me from beneath his brow, his gaze sharp. You're right, Watson. We've been running in circles for far too long, but we're nearly there. I can feel it. As our carriage drew closer to the station, Holmes turned to me with a quick smile that almost seemed out of place, given the gravity of the situation. You've been asking all the wrong questions, Watson. What if I told you that this chase had nothing to do with time or location, that it was always about the person? I blinked. The person? You mean the spy we've been tracking this entire time? Precisely, Holmes said, his voice lower now, his lips tight. And that's the part you've missed. You've assumed we're hunting a man, but what if we're after someone else entirely? I frowned, the realization dawning upon me like a bolt of lightning. You mean a woman? Holmes nodded. Indeed, it explains the careful avoidance of suspicion, the subtlety, the clever misdirection. We've been chasing shadows because we've been expecting something familiar, but in truth, we've been misled. Our carriage came to a stop just outside the station, and Holmes was already moving toward the door before it had fully come to rest. Come, Watson, we've no time to waste. We dashed through the drizzle, the cold dampness biting at our skin as we entered the main station. The hustle of the crowds did little to dampen Holmes's focus. His eyes scanned the faces around us with that unmistakable intensity, looking for the faintest signs of recognition, anything that might betray our quarry. We've still 10 minutes before the train departs, Holmes muttered, mostly to himself. That's more than enough time for a proper pursuit, but we'll have to be quick. No mistakes. We made our way through the crowded station, the sound of distant announcements filling the air. As we passed by the platforms, I saw Holmes glance toward the ticket booth before he motioned for me to follow. We approached a narrow alleyway near the back of the station, where the trains to the continent awaited. Holmes crouched low, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of someone, an individual who did not fit with the ordinary passengers. A woman. She was standing in the shadows near a luggage cart, her posture too still, too deliberate. That's her, Holmes whispered, his voice low but filled with certainty. I'll take the left side. You circle round. Before I could respond, Holmes had already darted off, blending into the crowd with an ease I could only admire. I did my best to follow his instructions, moving quickly and carefully to the other side of the platform. My heart raced as I edged closer, my eyes fixed on the woman. There was something about her, an air of quiet confidence that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. I could see now that she was young, her dark hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her features partially obscured. She seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. But who? I felt a sudden urge to close the gap between us, and I quickened my pace. But the woman turned sharply and stepped into the doorway of a nearby service room. I rushed after her, my steps quickening as I rounded the corner. Just as I reached the doorway, a pair of gloved hands shot out from within, grabbing hold of my arm with surprising strength. I yanked back, but the grip tightened. Watson, no! Holmes's voice rang out just in time. He appeared from the shadows, his eyes alight with realization. It's a trap, he hissed. She's expecting us! But before we could react further, the woman released her hold on me and spun to face Holmes, her movements swift and graceful, like a dancer, yet deadly. Her eyes locked on his, a knowing glint flashing in their depths. You're a bit slow, Sherlock Holmes, she said, her voice calm but filled with a mocking edge. I had hoped you'd catch on sooner. Holmes stood frozen for a moment, his gaze studying her as if she were just another puzzle waiting to be solved. I see, he murmured. The game changes now. She smirked. It's always been this way, Holmes. You've just been too caught up in your own little chase to notice. I moved forward, trying to maintain my composure. Who are you? I demanded. What is this all about? The woman looked at me for the first time, her expression softening ever so slightly. Who I am is of little consequence, Dr. Watson. What matters is what comes next. Holmes's eyes never left hers, his mind clearly racing. This is no ordinary case, is it? He asked. She shook her head. No. And it's not over yet. The sound of a train's whistle pierced the air, signaling the imminent departure. But the woman didn't flinch. She seemed far too composed for someone who was about to board a train to a foreign destination. Instead, she took a step back, her expression hardening. This isn't the end, Sherlock, she said, her eyes narrowing. It's only the beginning. Before either of us could move, she turned and vanished into the crowd, slipping away with an elegance that defied her role in this dangerous game. After her! Holmes shouted, taking off in a sprint, and I was close behind, my heart pounding in my chest. But the woman was already gone, swallowed by the mass of people surging toward the train. We reached the platform just as the train began to pull away, its wheels screeching as it picked up speed, and with it, our quarry, the woman, the spy. Holmes stood on the edge of the platform, his expression grim. "We've lost her. For now," he said softly, his gaze distant. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the verge of something monumental, that this chase after a woman, a spy, was only the beginning of a far greater game. But Holmes was already thinking ahead, his mind racing toward the next step. "We may have lost this round, Watson," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "But it is not the end. We will find her again. And when we do, the truth will be revealed." As the train disappeared into the distance, I couldn't help but feel that the puzzle was far from solved. In fact, it was only just beginning. Chapter 9. A Family Divided. The following days were heavy with silence, as Holmes and I retreated back to our rooms at 221B Baker Street. The chase had been exhilarating, but it had led us to no conclusions, only more questions. Yet Holmes, as always, was far from discouraged. His mind raced in 1,000 directions, and I could see that he had already moved beyond the immediate failure of the train station. But as for myself, I was troubled by the events that had unfolded. "How could we have missed it, Holmes?" I asked, pacing back and forth as I attempted to piece together the fragments of information that had slipped through our fingers. The woman. She wasn't just a spy. She was someone who knew exactly how to play us. Holmes sat in his usual armchair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. His gaze, as sharp as ever, was fixed on the fire that crackled in the hearth. He did not answer immediately, and I felt a growing sense of unease settle over me. "Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice calm but filled with a certain conviction, "I believe we've been misled, and in a most peculiar way." I stopped pacing and turned to him, waiting for the next revelation. "Misled? How?" "Think back," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming with the flicker of understanding. "We've been so focused on the immediate danger, on the spy, that we failed to ask the most obvious question. Who is she? Why was she so confident, so familiar with our tactics? And most importantly, why did she lead us directly to the train station when it was clear we were closing in on her?" "Because she wanted us to follow," I said, the realization dawning on me. She wanted us to see her, to think we were chasing her when in truth we were only chasing a ghost. Holmes nodded grimly. "Precisely. And now I have come to a rather startling conclusion." He leaned forward, his voice lowering as he continued. "Our spy, Watson, is not simply an agent of a foreign power. She is someone far closer to home, someone with an intimate understanding of the political landscape we've been trying to navigate. The connection to the Home Secretary, it's not a coincidence." I stared at him in disbelief. "Are you suggesting she's related to the Home Secretary?" Holmes's eyes gleamed as he nodded. "Indeed, she is his cousin, and therein lies the key to understanding everything that has happened over the past 30 years. I felt my mind reel. His cousin? But how could that be? The Home Secretary's family, Watson, is far from ordinary. There is a history of division, of rivalry, stretching back to the last great conflict, the war with Germany. During that time, the Home Secretary's family was torn apart, each side choosing a different path. The bitter divisions ran so deep that even now, some relatives cannot speak to one another." I felt a chill run down my spine as I began to understand the magnitude of what Holmes was implying. This woman, the spy we've been tracking, she is the daughter of one of those very family members. She was raised on the other side of that rift, on the side of those who still hold a deep grudge against England, a grudge that runs all the way back to the Kaiser's regime. Holmes stood up suddenly, his eyes flashing with the brilliance of his deduction. "The past, Watson, is never truly gone. It lingers, festering in the shadows, waiting to resurface at the most inopportune moment. This spy, this woman, she is not only a foreign agent, she is the product of that ancient, bitter rivalry." I felt as though I had been struck by a revelation too vast to fully comprehend. So this family feud, it's been passed down from generation to generation, and now it has come to this? Holmes nodded, his gaze distant as he pieced the puzzle together. "Yes, Watson. and it has created the perfect environment for espionage. It is easy to turn someone against their own country when the seeds of hatred are planted early, when the echoes of past wrongs can be manipulated and twisted to serve a greater purpose. I could see the weight of the situation settling on Holmes's shoulders. But what does this mean for us? For the Home Secretary? For the entire country? Holmes turned to face me, his expression unwavering. It means, Watson, that we are dealing with far more than just a simple spy network. This is a family affair, a twisted web of betrayal and loyalty. The spy we've been chasing is not merely working for a foreign power. She is part of a much larger scheme to weaken England from within. I felt a sense of unease growing in my chest. You're suggesting that this family feud is being used as a tool of espionage, a way to destabilize the government? To put pressure on the Home Secretary? Holmes's gaze hardened. Precisely. And if we don't stop her now, Watson, the consequences could be disastrous. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of us. It was clear that we were facing a far more intricate and dangerous game than we had initially realized. And yet, despite the danger, I knew that Holmes was determined to see this through to the end. I will need to meet with Mycroft, Holmes said suddenly, breaking the silence. We must understand the full extent of this network. I have no doubt that the government is being kept in the dark about these developments. I nodded, recognizing the necessity of involving Mycroft. But what about the woman? The spy? Holmes smiled grimly. She will be dealt with, Watson. But first, we need to understand her motivations. The truth is, she is not just a pawn in someone else's game. She is a player in her own right. And if we are to stop her, we must understand the family that birthed her, the grudge that fuels her. As Holmes turned toward the door, I could see the determination in his eyes. Come, Watson, the game is afoot. The next morning, we found ourselves at Mycroft's office, awaiting an audience with the government's most secretive and influential figure. Mycroft, as always, was calm and composed, his keen mind working far ahead of the rest of us. Holmes wasted no time in explaining the situation. Mycroft, Holmes began, we believe the spy we've been tracking is not only an agent of a foreign power, but also a relative of the Home Secretary, a cousin embroiled in a bitter family feud stretching back to the war with Germany. Mycroft's expression remained unchanged, but I could see the faintest flicker of surprise in his eyes. A family feud? Mycroft asked, his voice cold and precise. This is a most inconvenient development. Holmes nodded. Indeed, it appears that the spy's actions are part of a larger plan to destabilize the government by exploiting these family divisions. She's been turned, Mycroft, turned by a deep-seated hatred that has been passed down through generations. Mycroft sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers in thought. This is troubling news, Sherlock, but I must admit, I find it difficult to believe that this family feud could be the driving force behind such elaborate espionage. Surely there are more pressing matters for the government to focus on. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and yet, Mycroft, the evidence points to something far more insidious. If we don't act quickly, the entire situation could escalate into something far worse. For a moment, Mycroft remained silent, his expression unreadable. Then, with a small sigh, he rose from his chair and walked to the window, gazing out over the city. You may be right, Sherlock. I will begin investigating this matter further. But I must warn you, this is not a matter to be taken lightly. The Home Secretary's family has powerful allies, and if they are involved, we may be facing an international crisis. Holmes's gaze hardened. Then it is all the more important that we move quickly. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this situation becomes. Mycroft turned to face us, his expression somber. I will begin gathering information, but I fear that this is only the beginning of something far darker than either of you realize. With that, we left Mycroft's office, the weight of his words hanging over us. Holmes was already deep in thought, no doubt devising his next move. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to step into something far larger than we had ever imagined, a web of intrigue, betrayal, and a family torn apart by the legacy of war. And in the center of it all, the spy, the woman who had once been a cousin, now a foe. We were closer than ever to the truth. But in this game, the stakes were higher than either of us could have anticipated. Chapter 9. A Family Divided. The following days were heavy with silence, as Holmes and I retreated back to our rooms at 221B Baker Street. The chase had been exhilarating, but it had led us to no conclusions, only more questions. Yet Holmes, as always, was far from discouraged. His mind raced in 1,000 directions, and I could see that he had already moved beyond the immediate failure of the train station. But as for myself, I was troubled by the events that had unfolded. "How could we have missed it, Holmes?" I asked, pacing back and forth as I attempted to piece together the fragments of information that had slipped through our fingers. The woman, she wasn't just a spy. She was someone who knew exactly how to play us. Holmes sat in his usual armchair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. His gaze, as sharp as ever, was fixed on the fire that crackled in the hearth. He did not answer immediately, and I felt a growing sense of unease settle over me. "Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice calm but filled with a certain conviction. "I believe we've been misled, and in a most peculiar way." I stopped pacing and turned to him, waiting for the next revelation. "Misled? How?" "Think back," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming with the flicker of understanding. "We've been so focused on the immediate danger on the spy that we failed to ask the most obvious question. Who is she? Why was she so confident, so familiar with our tactics? And most importantly, why did she lead us directly to the train station when it was clear we were closing in on her?" "Because she wanted us to follow," I said, the realization dawning on me. She wanted us to see her, to think we were chasing her when in truth, we were only chasing a ghost. Holmes nodded grimly. "Precisely. And now I have come to a rather startling conclusion." He leaned forward, his voice lowering as he continued. "Our spy, Watson, is not simply an agent of a foreign power. She is someone far closer to home, someone with an intimate understanding of the political landscape we've been trying to navigate. The connection to the Home Secretary, it's not a coincidence." I stared at him in disbelief. "Are you suggesting she's related to the Home Secretary?" Holmes's eyes gleamed as he nodded. "Indeed, she is his cousin. And therein lies the key to understanding everything that has happened over the past 30 years. I felt my mind reel. His cousin? But how could that be? The Home Secretary's family, Watson, is far from ordinary. There is a history of division, of rivalry, stretching back to the last great conflict, the war with Germany. During that time, the Home Secretary's family was torn apart, each side choosing a different path. The bitter divisions ran so deep that even now, some relatives cannot speak to one another. I felt a chill run down my spine as I began to understand the magnitude of what Holmes was implying. This woman, the spy we've been tracking, she is the daughter of one of those very family members. She was raised on the other side of that rift, on the side of those who still hold a deep grudge against England. A grudge that runs all the way back to the Kaiser's regime. Holmes stood up suddenly, his eyes flashing with the brilliance of his deduction. "The past, Watson, is never truly gone. It lingers, festering in the shadows, waiting to resurface at the most inopportune moment. This spy, this woman, she is not only a foreign agent, she is the product of that ancient bitter rivalry." I felt as though I had been struck by a revelation too vast to fully comprehend. So this family feud, it's been passed down from generation to generation, and now it has come to this? Holmes nodded, his gaze distant as he pieced the puzzle together. "Yes, Watson, and it has created the perfect environment for espionage. It is easy to turn someone against their own country when the seeds of hatred are planted early, when the echoes of past wrongs can be manipulated and twisted to serve a greater purpose." I could see the weight of the situation settling on Holmes's shoulders. But what does this mean for us? For the Home Secretary? For the entire country? Holmes turned to face me, his expression unwavering. "It means, Watson, that we are dealing with far more than just a simple spy network. This is a family affair, a twisted web of betrayal and loyalty. The spy we've been chasing is not merely working for a foreign power. She is part of a much larger scheme to weaken England from within." I felt a sense of unease growing in my chest. "You're suggesting that this family feud is being used as a tool of espionage, a way to destabilize the government? To put pressure on the Home Secretary?" Holmes's gaze hardened. "Precisely. And if we don't stop her now, Watson, The consequences could be disastrous. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of us. It was clear that we were facing a far more intricate and dangerous game than we had initially realized. And yet, despite the danger, I knew that Holmes was determined to see this through to the end. "I will need to meet with Mycroft," Holmes said suddenly, breaking the silence. "We must understand the full extent of this network. I have no doubt that the government is being kept in the dark about these developments." I nodded, recognizing the necessity of involving Mycroft. "But what about the woman, the spy?" Holmes smiled grimly. "She will be dealt with, Watson. But first, we need to understand her motivations. The truth is, she is not just a pawn in someone else's game. She is a player in her own right. And if we are to stop her, we must understand the family that birthed her, the grudge that fuels her." As Holmes turned toward the door, I could see the determination in his eyes. "Come, Watson. The game is afoot." The next morning, we found ourselves at Mycroft's office, awaiting an audience with the government's most secretive and influential figure. Mycroft, as always, was calm and composed, his keen mind working far ahead of the rest of us. Holmes wasted no time in explaining the situation. "Mycroft," Holmes began, "we believe the spy we've been tracking is not only an agent of a foreign power, but also a relative of the Home Secretary, a cousin embroiled in a bitter family feud stretching back to the war with Germany." Mycroft's expression remained unchanged, but I could see the faintest flicker of surprise in his eyes. "A family feud?" Mycroft asked, his voice cold and precise. "This is a most inconvenient development." Holmes nodded. "Indeed. It appears that the spy's actions are part of a larger plan to destabilize the government by exploiting these family divisions. She's been turned, Mycroft. Turned by a deep-seated hatred that has been passed down through generations." Mycroft sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers in thought. "This is troubling news, Sherlock, but I must admit, I find it difficult to believe that this family feud could be the driving force behind such elaborate espionage. Surely there are more pressing matters for the government to focus on." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And yet, Mycroft, the evidence points to something far more insidious. If we don't act quickly, the entire situation could escalate into something far worse." For a moment, Mycroft remained silent, his expression unreadable. Then, with a small sigh, he rose from his chair and walked to the window, gazing out over the city. "You may be right, Sherlock. I will begin investigating this matter further. But I must warn you, this is not a matter to be taken lightly. The Home Secretary's family has powerful allies, and if they are involved, we may be facing an international crisis." Holmes's gaze hardened. "Then it is all the more important that we move quickly. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this situation becomes." Mycroft turned to face us, his expression somber. "I will begin gathering information, but I fear that this is only the beginning of something far darker than either of you realize." With that, we left Mycroft's office, the weight of his words hanging over us. Holmes was already deep in thought, no doubt devising his next move, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to step into something far larger than we had ever imagined. A web of intrigue, betrayal, and a family torn apart by the legacy of war. And in the center of it all, the spy. The woman who had once been a cousin, now a foe. We were closer than ever to the truth. But in this game, the stakes were higher than either of us could have anticipated. Chapter 10, The Final Reckoning. The weeks that followed our meeting with Mycroft were filled with a tense anticipation, for it was clear that we had crossed into dangerous territory. What had begun as a simple bank robbery had swiftly evolved into a shadowy web of espionage, personal vendettas, and international intrigue, seemingly orchestrated by forces both domestic and foreign. The threads that Holmes and I had been pulling on led only to deeper mysteries, and though we had chased the spy relentlessly, she had remained elusive, always one step ahead. And then came the moment that we had both been dreading. The Home Secretary's wife was still missing, and with each passing day, the government's resolve seemed to weaken. The pressure mounted as the Home Secretary himself began to unravel. Mycroft, ever the pillar of calm, had continued his inquiries with his usual bureaucratic precision, but even he had confessed that the depth of the conspiracy was troubling. Every lead we had pursued had turned up another layer of duplicity, each more sinister than the last. Holmes, ever the optimist in the face of adversity, remained certain that the truth was within reach. Yet, despite his brilliant deductions and tireless pursuit of the case, the deeper we delved, the murkier the waters became. I had never seen him so lost in his thoughts, his mind turning over every detail, every piece of the puzzle, like a man struggling to put together a shattered mirror. We sat in our familiar sitting room at 221B, the weight of the investigation pressing heavily on our shoulders. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between us. "I have been turning this case over and over, but I find myself at an impasse. What began as a simple robbery now carries the potential to ignite an international conflict. The papers we recovered from the burned letters in Soho are undeniably tied to the Kaiser's regime, and the spy's family history makes her involvement all the more damning. But there is something I am missing, something that doesn't quite fit." I sat opposite him, my hands clasped in front of me, reflecting on the enormity of the situation. "You're saying there's a greater purpose behind all of this?" Holmes's sharp gaze met mine. "Precisely. The robbery was just a diversion. The kidnapping of the Home Secretary's wife, a move calculated to apply pressure on the government, was only part of a much larger scheme. But the question remains, what is the end goal?" At that moment, there was a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson appeared with a letter, its seal bearing the familiar mark of Mycroft. Holmes immediately reached for the envelope, his fingers barely grazing the wax before tearing it open. "Another missive from Mycroft?" I asked, leaning forward. "What does it say?" Holmes scanned the contents quickly, his expression unreadable. "It seems Mycroft has uncovered something significant." "Significant?" I asked, leaning in closer, my interest piqued. "What is it?" Holmes placed the letter on the table before me, his eyes narrowing. "It seems the Home Secretary has been involved in something far darker than we could have anticipated. Mycroft's sources have uncovered a network of spies within the highest levels of the British government, a network dating back to the days of the Boer War." I blinked in surprise. "The Boer War? How does that fit into all of this?" Holmes folded his hands thoughtfully. "It appears that certain factions within the government have been compromised for years. The spy we've been tracking, Watson, is merely a piece of the puzzle, and now we must figure out who is pulling the strings from the shadows." I felt a sinking sensation in my chest. "And the Home Secretary? He's involved in all of this?" Holmes hesitated for a moment, his brow furrowing. "The Home Secretary himself may be an unwitting pawn, Watson. The real question lies with the group he's associated with. There is a faction, an underground network, that has been manipulating events behind the scenes. They have been using the Home Secretary as a figurehead, controlling his every move." I felt my heart skip a beat. But why? Why go through such lengths to control the Home Secretary? Holmes met my gaze, his voice cold. "Because, Watson, the stakes are far higher than we could have imagined. This network's goal is not simply political leverage. It is to manipulate the entire course of history." I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the enormity of Holmes's deduction. So this is a plot on a scale we've never seen before. But how does the spy, the woman, fit into all of this? Holmes's gaze hardened. "She is the key to unraveling it all, Watson. She has been manipulated just as the Home Secretary has. But unlike him, she has a personal vendetta to drive her actions. And if we don't stop her, she will succeed in her mission to destabilize this nation, and perhaps the world." The words hung heavy in the room, the weight of them pressing down on me. I had seen Holmes face dangerous criminals, murderous conspirators, and shadowy figures from the criminal underworld. But this felt different. This was no ordinary case. This was a web of deceit that spanned continents, and we were standing on the precipice of something far more dangerous than a mere spy ring. Holmes stood suddenly, a determined look in his eyes. "There is no time to waste, Watson. We must track down the spy before she can put her plan into motion." But just as we were about to make our move, another unexpected visitor arrived, a figure cloaked in mystery. Detective Lestrade, whose presence had become a regular fixture in our investigation, entered the room with a look of urgency on his face. "Holmes! Watson!" he exclaimed, his breath coming in short gasps. You'll want to see this. We've just received word of an assassination attempt." "An assassination attempt," Holmes repeated, his voice sharp with concern. "Who was the target?" Lestrade hesitated, his face grim. "The Home Secretary." I felt my blood run cold. "What? How? Why?" Lestrade shook his head. "It's all very unclear at the moment, but we believe the spy, she's involved in some way. It's possible that she intended to kill him before he could speak to anyone about what's been happening. She's trying to silence him." Holmes's expression darkened. "And the Home Secretary? Is he alive?" "For now," Lestrade said, his face drawn tight with tension. "But the situation is dire. We need to move quickly, Holmes. This may be the final piece of the puzzle." Holmes nodded sharply, his mind already racing. "Then let's go, Watson. There is no time to waste. We must stop this before it's too late." As we followed Lestrade through the streets of London, I could sense the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on all of us. What had begun as a simple robbery was now a race against time, a final confrontation that would determine the fate of the nation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more at play here, something even darker than we had yet uncovered. And I feared that, no matter how hard we tried, we might be too late to stop it. Epilogue, the last move. As the door to 221B Baker Street swung closed behind us, the city of London stretched out before us, seemingly as unaware of the turmoil we had just endured as it had been before it all began. The streets, bustling with the usual noise of horse-drawn carriages, pedestrians, and the far-off rumble of distant trains, were the same. And yet, they were not. What had once seemed a small robbery, an innocent mistake by an inexperienced thief, had grown into a dangerous international incident. It had pulled us into the very heart of a conspiracy, orchestrated by one of the most intelligent and ruthless men I had ever known. My own brother, Mycroft Holmes. As I stepped out onto the streets, the gray sky above me seemed to mirror the storm of thoughts churning in my mind. There was no peace, no resolution to the dark puzzle we had just solved. Mycroft's grand plan had been undone, but I could not shake the feeling that we had only uncovered the tip of an iceberg. What he had left behind, what he had set in motion before his capture, remained to be seen. "What's next, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice steady but tinged with a weariness that mirrored my own. I glanced at him, pausing for a moment before responding. "For now, Watson, there is nothing. But in my gut, I feel it. There is more to this than meets the eye. The players have changed, but the game remains the same." Watson gave a low chuckle, but there was an edge to it. "Always so dramatic, Holmes." I smirked, my thoughts already elsewhere. He was right, of course. I had always seen the world through a lens of grand schemes and intricate plots. It was a curse, no doubt, but it had served me well in the past. Yet even I could not ignore the niggling doubt at the back of my mind. What Mycroft said before he was taken away? I muttered, half to myself. Watson's expression softened. "You're not still thinking about it, are you?" I stopped walking and turned to face him, my eyes narrowing slightly. "I cannot shake it, Watson. The pieces have been moved. What if Mycroft was right? What if, despite all our efforts, the future has already been set into motion?" Watson placed a hand on my shoulder, an unusual gesture of solidarity. "Holmes, you've done enough. You've unraveled a conspiracy that could have torn the country apart. Let others worry about the rest." He was right, of course. There was little more that I could do for now. Mycroft's influence had been weakened, and his network of spies was being disbanded as we spoke. But that seed of doubt planted by his final words refused to leave me. I straightened, taking a deep breath. "For now, Watson, I think I need to clear my mind. Perhaps a trip to the countryside is in order. A little time away from the noise of London." Watson raised an eyebrow but nodded. "That sounds like an excellent idea. A bit of fresh air would do us both some good." We continued our walk down the familiar streets, the conversation drifting to less weighty matters. Yet even as we spoke of trivialities, I could not shake the feeling that the case was not truly over. The pieces had been moved, but the game was far from finished. As we reached the corner of Baker Street, I glanced back over my shoulder at the old building that had been both my sanctuary and my prison. For now, it felt quiet, almost peaceful. But the quiet after a storm is always the most dangerous time. The calm before the next wave. With a sigh, I turned to Watson, who was eyeing me with mild curiosity. "I suppose," I said with a small smile, "we shall see what comes next, Watson. The game, though it may appear to have ended, has only just begun." Watson smiled back, a glint of understanding in his eyes. "And as always, Holmes, I'll be by your side." Together, we walked into the unknown, our footsteps echoing softly on the cobblestone streets of London. The city was alive with its usual hustle and bustle, but beneath the surface, the world had changed. Mycroft's legacy, though fractured, was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. There would be more mysteries, more threats, and more danger to face. But for now, the game was over. Yet, deep in my bones, I knew that the next move would come soon. And when it did, I would be ready. The end. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to leave a comment letting us know which story you'd like to hear next and where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our detective fans around the world. See you in the next adventure.